Nintendo and Sega, one-time bitter rivals for supremacy over the home and portable consoles market. You all probably know the story and what happened and how it impacted the entire video games industry. Then after Sega pulled out the hardware race and became just a publisher and developer of software, who could forget the shocking moment in 2001 when Sonic debuted on Nintendo's Game Boy Advance in 2001, or when Mario and Sonic joined together in a video game celebration of the 2008 Beijing Olympic Games? But it might surprise you that during their intense rivalry of the 80s and 90s, there was once a time when Sega weren't exactly against the idea of their games appearing on a Nintendo console. On the contrary, a number of their biggest arcade classics appeared on the Nintendo Entertainment System, as well as other systems including many of the 8-bit microcomputers of the 80s like the Spectrum, the Commodore and the Amstrad. And while a few of these ports were handled by licensed third parties, the development duties of some of these NES and Famicom games were actually handled by Sega themselves. And this week I'm going to talk about some of them, or at least all of them in fact. Now if you've played any versions of these games, please do let me know in the comments below and tell me more about how you feel about these games. So then, on with the show. I'm not really going to pretend that I like Altered Beast, or at least the original Mega Drive version. I always found that although it looked pretty damn good at the time, it was just so sluggish and repetitive that it was just a chore to play, and it's only aged worse. This Famicom version, developed by Sega and released exclusively in Japan in 1990 under its original Japanese name of Juoki, arguably looks much worse than the arcade and Mega Drive versions, with the tiniest of sprites and a third of the screen taken up by the in-game display. However, it actually plays considerably faster than its bigger, more impressive versions, and on top of that, this port adds 3 extra levels, including new transformations such as a shark and a bird. Honestly, for what it lacks in presentation, it makes up for by actually being pretty playable. I was actually quite impressed by this port, which is something I thought I would never say about any version of Altered Beast. Afterburner and its sequel were 2 of Sega's most impressive arcade cabinets, with the lesser seen hydraulic cabinets being a real spectacle of the arcade, as the player would sit down in a faux cockpit and be moved around with the in-game action. Obviously, the home ports will be nowhere near as incredible, but boy, there were a lot of versions for pretty much every system, and the Nintendo Entertainment System was no exception. But here is where it gets weird. There were actually 2 Afterburner ports, Afterburner and Afterburner 2. However, they are both ports of the second Afterburner release, Afterburner 2, made by different publishers for different global markets. You've got the Western release in 1989, just titled as Afterburner, which is an unlicensed release by Tengen, the infamous American branch of Atari Games that reverse engineered the NES by requesting the technical specifications of the system's lockout capabilities. To do this, they claimed that they would need this for a court matter with Nintendo, which they didn't. They used this information to get around the lockout chip and distribute their own games without making a licensing deal with Nintendo. In any case, they published this version of Afterburner in Western territories, and it's not great to be honest. The sprites are small and they flicker so much that the game is barely playable. But in that same year, Sunsoft released Afterburner 2 exclusively in Japan, and it is pretty much a tidied up version of the exact same game. It is much more impressive in terms of presentation, with a great looking intro, sprites that don't flicker so much, and in true Sunsoft style, much better music, and even some digitised speech. It is arguably much better than Tengen's version, which, to be honest, is usually the case. This is Space Harrier, a third-person rail shooter where the action comes at you thick and fast. Despite the original intention of it being a military-style shooter where you controlled a fighter jet, during development the whole premise was then changed to a surreal sci-fi fantasy adventure. Meanwhile, a Japan-exclusive port made its way to the Famicom courtesy of Sega's own AM2 studio and Takara on publishing duties. It unfortunately doesn't look anywhere near as good as the original versions thanks to a more weedy looking sprite, which really makes for an underwhelming port. However, those visual sacrifices might have made it look bad in comparison to the Master System ports, especially when it came down to flicker. It's certainly a smoother playing game than its rival version, which contributes somewhat to making this version actually quite fun. Although it is lacking the fast pace of the original arcade version, you'd better be good at this game, as you're only given 3 lives initially to beat all 18 levels, and you'll rarely get given more. Alien Syndrome is next on the list, a sci-fi top-down arcade shooter where up to 2 players must rescue the crew of various space stations while gunning down some alien nasties. The catch is that you must save all of your colleagues and exit the level before a timer runs down. And this NES port that was released in both Japan and the West, with Tengen once again publishing the game over here, is actually a pretty competent port. It's a relatively simple game all things considered, and that lack of complexity allows the game to translate very well to the system. It's a very playable, if repetitive release, but it's still one of the better ports on this list. Shinobi is one of Sega's biggest hits of the 80s and is one of those IPs that really could do with a proper update. After all, ninjas never ever go out of style. While its sequels went a little more wild with the subject matter, the original game's modern day setting was quite unique for a game about ninjas. Unfortunately, the NES version released exclusively in the West once again by Tengen is not so interesting. It doesn't do a particularly good job of translating Shinobi's action, with bad controls and some really awful visuals. Look at that particularly nasty shade of yellow and purple. It also feels incredibly stiff and not really very fun to play, which of course is somewhat of a problem for any game. The music is particularly bad because it's all over the place, and what the hell is up with the first level boss throwing what appears to be meatballs? It's just another Tengen botch job, unfortunately. Last up are three ports of the Fantasy Zone series. The original Fantasy Zone is a very odd candy coloured scrolling shooter where you've got to destroy your enemies and collect as much money as possible to buy better tech for your ship and progress further. It's basically capitalism the game. But it also found its way to both the NES and Famicom, and in the same way that there were two almost identical versions of Afterburner, Sunsoft developed a version of this Fantasy Zone game for Japanese territories, while Tengen did their very own version for the Western market. Sunsoft's version came first in 1987, and visually there's just too much going on, with incredibly noisy backgrounds that just blend in with everything as well as the sprites, although it is relatively accurate to the arcade original. But this version's biggest problem is the flickery visuals, which make it even more difficult to read what is going on screen. Meanwhile, Tengen's port goes the other way around and is a little bit simpler in terms of visuals, but the bold sprites and less detailed backgrounds mean that at least it's a lot easier to see what's going on. However, the status bar at the bottom of the screen can be pretty ugly and unreadable at times, as it changes colour for each stage. Sunsoft also ported the game's sequel, Fantasy Zone 2, The Teardrop of Opa Opa, to the Famicom, and the sprite work definitely has a lot more of that bold look from the arcade original. Interestingly enough, this game came to Sega's Master System first, before it was ported to the arcade and everywhere else. With that in mind, the NES version doesn't look quite as good as the original Master System release, but it is still pretty fun. So that is hopefully a whole heap of Sega games released on Nintendo's 8-bit system. Hopefully you have learned something new, or at least found this video entertaining enough. After all, you have made it this far. Now, how many of these games have you played a version of, or either on the NES, the Famicom, or any of the 8-bit microcomputers? Please let me know in the comments as usual. Now, as always, if you like this video, well, you should have put a click on it, the subscribe button that is. I'll be back very soon with some more gaming greatness, so until then, happy gaming.